Hello everyone, and welcome back to Fundamentals of Programming. This is lesson 12, and today we will talk about something called loops. Loops allow us to repeat code, and that might seem a little mundane and probably pointless because, we can copy and paste code if we want to repeat it. Well, there's some issues involved in doing that. It makes our code more error-prone because we are, after all, human. If we need to make modifications to each of the code that we copy and paste, then we might miss something, and that might make our code break. The second reason is maintainability. If we have copied and pasted the same code many times and then we need to go back and make modifications to all of that code, we have to do that, and that is a major pain. And third, it's really not feasible. If we need to repeat the same code for 50 times, then we would have to copy and paste the same code 50 times. And that's not something that we really want to spend our time doing. We want to make our time more efficient because time is money, especially if you program for a living. So today we are going to look at two things. We are first going to write some code by copying and pasting, and then we will refactor that code to use a loop so that you can see how loops make our lives easier. We are going to write an application that writes a simple times table to the browser's JavaScript console. So we're going to go 0 times 2, 1 times 2, 2 times 2, 3 times 2, so on and so forth. Now, something that you haven't seen in this course yet is this console.log. This console is an object. This represents the JavaScript console within the browser. It's not given to us by the JavaScript language, it's given to us by the browser. Now, we haven't really gotten into object-oriented programming concepts yet, and we really will stay somewhat away from them in this course because you're just learning how to program. Getting into object-oriented programming is something else entirely. But it's really easy to get into the mindset because we live in an object-oriented world. No matter what you come in contact with or who you come in contact with, you could classify everything as a particular type of object. So this console is an object, and it has what's called a method. And a method is really nothing more than a function in JavaScript, just like the alert function that we've been using to display a message in a dialog box. The log method or function displays a message inside of the JavaScript console. So in order to access the JavaScript console, we have to use this console object and then use the period here and then log to write something to the JavaScript console. And the message that we are writing is a string that's going to have our times table, 0 times 2 in this case, and then an equals, and then we actually perform that calculation. Now notice we haven't put any parentheses around this 0 times 2. And the reason being because this is multiplication. This has a higher order of precedence than a string concatenation. So 0 times 2 is going to execute before the string 0 times 2 equals concatenates with the number that is the product of the multiplication operation. So the first thing we'll do is copy this line of code and paste it on the next line. And then we will modify it so that it is 1 times 2, and then we need to modify the actual calculation that occurs. So we will do 1 times 2 as well. And then we will paste again. We'll do 2 times 2. Paste again, 3 times 2. We're going to go to 5. Now, you can already see that this is going to take some time. And it's also error prone because we have to paste that line of code and then make the modifications. And if we make the wrong modification, then we run the risk of causing our code to not work. So let's run this in the browser. Let's see if I have it here. Lesson 12. We'll run this. And we will open up the JavaScript console. I'm going to press Ctrl-Shift-J. And we can see that we have our times table. 0 times 2 is 2. 1 times 2 is 2. 4, 6, 8. And here we have an issue. We have 5 times 2, but it's giving us the value of 12. This is supposed to be 10. So if we go back to our code and we look, we can see that, yes, I did make a mistake. So we need to change that back to 5, go back to the browser, refresh, and then we have the right times table here, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Well, let's make this code a little bit easier to write and maintain by using a loop. Now, the JavaScript language gives us many loops, but there are two that we will talk about because they are common between pretty much all programming languages. One is the for loop, and the other is the while loop. We're going to start with the while loop first and then talk about the for. The while loop begins with the keyword while. And then we have a condition. And the idea behind the while loop is while the condition is true, execute the code inside of the curly braces. So this is a while loop. But since we have hard-coded true here, this is what's called an infinite loop. This loop will continue to execute forever and ever and ever and ever until we close the browser window. So it's very important for you to make sure that your loops never get into an infinite loop, because if they do, then you can run into some problems trying to get out of your particular application. So we ultimately want this condition to result in false. So we need to find some way to have the condition be true and then return false whenever we're done with the number 5. Well, one of the ways that we can do that is to use the number that we are multiplying by 2, because we start at 0 and then we go in numeric order, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we can have a variable called counter, initialize it as 0, and then inside of the loop we could modify the value of counter for each time the loop iterates. And we use the term iterate whenever we talk about a loop. We can say that the loop repeats, but the technical term is iterate. So for each iteration of the loop, we want to make the counter variable increment by 1. So we start at 0, and then the loop will iterate, and then we increment counter by 1, and then the loop will iterate again and again and again until counter is less than or equal to 5. So that's going to be our condition. As long as counter is less than or equal to 5, then we want our loop to execute or to iterate. So I'm going to copy some code here. And now we need to modify the code inside of the loop, because as it is right now, the loop is going to execute the code on line 3 6 times. It's going to start at 0 and end at 5, but it's going to do so by saying 5 times 2 equals 10, and it's going to print that out 6 times. In fact, let's go ahead and view that in the browser. There we go. We can see 5 times 2 equals 10. That's just repeated. So we want to use this counter variable inside of our call to console.log. So instead of specifying 5 here, we will do counter, and then we will concatenate that with the string of times 2 equals, and then we will replace 5 here and use counter again. So now let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh, and we will see our times table displayed once again. 0 times 2 is 0. 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. So by using a loop, we no longer had to copy and paste the same line of code and make tiny little modifications. All we had to do is use that code once, and the loop repeats it for us for as long as we want it to. So if we want to change how many times the loop iterates, all we have to do is change the condition. So now this is going to go for as long as counter is greater than or equal to 10. And all we had to do is make one change to our code to make that happen. So that's the while loop. Let's look at the for loop. The for loop is a little bit more complex than the while loop, and really it's the setup involved with the for loop that's a little bit confusing. At least it was for me whenever I was first learning how to program. So the more you write for loops, the easier it is until it's just second nature. So the for loop begins with the for keyword. It is FOR, it's not FOUR or the number 4, it is FOR. And then we have a set of parentheses, and inside of this parentheses are the setup for this loop. There are 3 things that we have to set up. First is the counter of the loop. So we'll go ahead and set that up. Now we've already done this with the while loop, except it's being done inside of the parentheses for the for loop. So we have var counter equals 0, and then we have a semicolon. And then the next thing we have is the condition of the loop. So we have as long as counter is less than or equal to, we'll do 5. And that is our condition. After the condition, we have a semicolon. And then we have the third piece of this setup, which is the incrementation, which is counter plus equals 1. So it has the same things that we used with the while loop. It's organized all in one line. Of course, it doesn't have to be all in one line. You can break it up into multiple lines if you want to. But each of these three things is separated by a semicolon. And then after you have set up the for loop, then you have the curly brace, and then you can put your code that you want to repeat in it. So I'm going to cut the call to console.log, and I'm going to get rid of the while loop entirely so that we can just see the for loop. Okay, so before we execute this, let's just go over this again because this can be confusing. We start with for, and then we have a set of parentheses, and inside of this parentheses we have the setup for this loop. We first have the counter, or this is actually called the initialization, and then we have the condition, counter is less than or equal to 5, and then we have the incrementation, counter plus 1 or plus equals 1, and then we have our code inside of the loop. So this is doing the same thing that the while loop did, it's just done so using a for loop. So let's save it, let's go to the browser, refresh, and we will see that we are getting the results that we got earlier. And to change as many iterations that we want, all we have to do is change our condition, go back to the browser, refresh, and there we go. Now, if you're like how I was when I was first learning how to program, you're probably thinking, why do we have different types of loops? I mean, because after all, we just wrote the same thing using two different loops. Well, it comes down to the scenario that we are trying to solve. The times table application uses a counter. Therefore, it works really well with a for loop because a counter is built into the initialization of the for loop. With the while loop, we had to define the counter independently of the loop. The whole idea of the for loop is to use the counter in the condition, and then increment the counter. So the counter just works really well with the for loop. The while loop works well with conditions that do not depend upon a counter. And unfortunately, I don't have a good example to give you. But anytime that you want to repeat the same code over and over again, and you don't have a counter or don't need a counter, then that would be a good reason to use a while loop. Well, in the next lesson, we are going to look at something called an array. An array is a data type in JavaScript, but it's a programming concept that can be found in just about every programming language that allows us to store a collection of values inside of one variable. And they also work really well with for loops. So we will look at arrays in lesson 13. Have a good one.